Whatever your background, you are welcome here. Thank you for coming. So I wanted to begin with a land acknowledgement, since that's always important, but maybe particularly so when our topic is partnering with the land themselves. So here in Boulder County, maybe let's just take a couple breaths. I always get nervous when people are here. Yeah, take a couple breaths and like feel the physicalness of your being and the air that is gifts from trees and algae, and your out breath that is gifts right back to them. And feeling that support of the earth beneath you. So here in Boulder County, we acknowledge that the land we live and work on is homeland to Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute nations. Colorado's Front Range is a contemporary and traditional site of living, trade, and gathering for many Indigenous peoples. The recitation of a land acknowledgement must go beyond recognition that Indigenous peoples exist and that the US and Colorado have a history of colonialism. And I'll put some links in the chat for ways to take action to build right relationship and get involved. So we've gathered today to hear from some local people engaged in practices that the film Kiss the Ground has been exploring. I know not everyone will have gotten a chance to watch the movie, and that's just fine. But our hope was to take kind of the broad issues and the possibilities from the film and link them to local efforts and opportunities, and kind of share how people can get involved. So build on this momentum and find community here. So we're being joined today by Hunter Lovins, and because of the hail that happened just recently, and this wonderful rain but came with hail, Phil Taylor won't be able to be with us, but Pete Terpenning will be able to be with us. And then Brett KenCairn had a family need that arose, but he recorded a short video for us just for this gathering of the things he'd wanted to share. So he'll be here too. And before we turn to the panel, I'm just going to invite us into breakout rooms of about 3 people so we can make some connections. And when we come back from our breakout rooms, I'll introduce the panel and we can hear from the folks on there before we open it up to questions. So people often wonder, in the face of all the social and environmental issues, what can I as an individual do to make a difference? And one of 350.org's founders, Bill McKibben, his answer to this is stop being an individual. And that's part of what we're doing today, joining with others who care. And the invitation in the breakout rooms is going to be to introduce yourself, share what faith tradition, if any, has shaped you in particular about your care for the earth, and share what brings you to this gathering today. So welcome back. Hopefully you have a little more sense of being in this together. And I'll introduce us to the panel. So Hunter Lovins is the president and founder of the National Capitalism Solutions, NCS, a nonprofit formed in 2002 in Longmont, Colorado. A renowned author and champion of sustainable development for over 35 years, Hunter has consulted on business, economic development, sustainable agriculture, energy, water security, and climate policies for scores of governments, communities, and companies worldwide. So glad you can be here today. And so Brett KenCairn, who's going to join us by video of a video, or I mean, we're all by video, so it doesn't make as much sense to say video now. But he serves as the City of Boulder's Senior Policy Advisor for Climate and the Environment. He's a systems change practitioner with extensive experience in regenerative ecosystems and economic design and implementation. Brett's currently focused on developing carbon management strategies that create climate stabilization and resilience through equity-based regenerative enterprises, and that's part of what he talks about in the video. And he has extensive background in community-based sustainable development, working in both rural, Native American, and other disadvantaged communities across the Western US. And Pete Terpenning is a retired minister of the Community United Church of Christ, which is part of this GreenFaith group. He's president of the board of Earth's Table and a mean organic gardener. So Hunter, I was curious if you would like to begin, or if you thought starting with Brett's video. I'm totally open either way, but I thought one of you should start.
Sure, why don't we start with Brett's video?
Okay, let me just get us.
Hello, friends. I'm so delighted and honored to be invited to join this panel. I'm sorry I couldn't be there digitally, at least in person, live, but it was really important to me to be able to participate in this, and to my other colleagues on this panel, hello, and I'm sorry that we won't have a chance to interact lively, because I think there's lots that we could, of course, talk about together. But I also felt strongly that it was important to share with all of you some important context to this work that we're talking about, and also some exciting new opportunities that are coming forward. And so my overview today is really to begin with what I believe is a kind of major paradigm change in the context of climate action, and how that is grounding and centering our relationship to the land as a critical new area of focus in climate action. How we're beginning to build that out, not only in Boulder, but in many other places, some of the new tools and strategies that we've been developing that hopefully you'll enjoy having a chance to play with, and where that's going in terms of both the action and the larger movement that's a part of this. So with that, I think really the context of this is, we had thought, and I think for understandable reasons, that the fundamental causal factor for climate change was the pumping of CO2 into the atmosphere as associated with fossil fuel use. And so this is a graph that is very common in the literature about the rise in CO2 and the rise in the burning of fossil fuels. And so that led to our sort of sense that the core action area for climate action was around changing our energy systems. And that was really the guidance and the focus for 20 plus years. But I think as we've started to realize that there are other aspects, especially a little bit more difficult to measure, and that's why we called them Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions. They were the things, the emissions associated with all of the things that we use and consume. And in a certain kind of way, it's been a little bit convenient for us to be able to kind of disregard that aspect, call it a sort of outside scope piece. But essentially, the consumption-based economy is also deeply implicated in this climate change context that we're living in. And this is a quote from the UN's 2020 GAP report. That's unfortunately the report UN is putting out about the difference between where we need to be and where we are, which of course is growing. But it notes that in this most recent GAP report that essentially consumption is now recognized as being a huge driver in climate change. But also that there's been, sorry, this computer is jumping around on its own. There's been a major shift based on the Intergovernmental Panels on Climate Change, IPCC's report that came out in 2018, which was essentially the report card on the Paris 2015 summit and how we were doing. And that report, from as far as I'm concerned, completely changed the paradigm of climate action, because it noted, of course, as the headlines of a couple of years ago noted, that we have probably 10 years or so to really change the course of this, which meant that this notion of 80% emissions reduction by 2050 was entirely insufficient. It had to be much faster. But the report also said that that time frame was not the only thing at play here. We've now pumped so much CO2 into the atmosphere that emissions reduction alone wasn't going to be enough. We now have to rapidly grow a carbon drawdown sequestration effort that will ultimately be as large as all of the fossil fuel companies today combined in order to be able to stabilize climate. And finally, this report noted that climate change is now going to advance at such a rate that we have to prepare our communities for climate change. So what it really did, though, was it brought essentially a new domain of action and causal factors into climate change. And I, without spending a lot of time on this today, it is why we're talking about soils and now a bunch of other aspects of natural climate solutions, because we recognize that how we're managing and relating to ecosystems are a major causative factor of this. So we now have 3 domains of action in the climate effort. So the consequences of this are dramatic. This is a report that actually came out 10 years ago, but is now unfortunately prescient to what's happening, that for every 1 degree increase in climate change, we're seeing dramatic changes in our landscape. And so we've already seen, as we know from last summer, how fires are increasing in incidence. What we may not also be thinking about is the implications that climate change is going to have on our sort of urban experience. Nearly a third of the communities right now, over 50,000, will by mid-century be experiencing heat indexes of over 105 degrees for up to 30 days at a time. There are only 3 places in our country right now that experience that. So we're going to experience dramatic changes in the context of our living. And our best, in my view, ally that we have not been engaging in this is the living world itself. Part of this is about understanding our context in a new way, and that is to remember that carbon is not a problem. It's not an evil thing. It's actually the fundamental basis of all organic life. We consume it 3 or 4 times a day. It's integral to everything that we are and everything around us. The problem is we're putting it in the wrong place, and what we need to do is take that carbon and take it out of where we've been putting it, namely the atmosphere, and putting it back into living systems, which can then enable those living systems to give us a whole bunch of the things that we're going to need, into urban forests to create shade, into soils to create soil moisture holding capacity and nutrient dense food, into the vegetation that will create better air quality for us. So that's what we need to be doing with carbon. This was further reinforced by an IPCC report that came out in 2019 called Climate Change in Land, which basically says, the only place that we actually know how to do this carbon drawdown at scale in any time near term is in land itself. So this is now one of the ways that it's referred to as natural climate solutions. This is a report that came out in 2017. There was another report in 2018 that talked about natural climate solutions in the U.S. And you can see one of these quotes, just how much this could be up to a third of all the climate action we need to take is working with land-based systems. So where are those big actions? Today you're going to talk a lot about soils. Forests, of course, are a huge part of this as well. And there are other things like biochar, which we're going to be working on a lot in this community, and that some people, like David Takahashi, actually has a little unit in his backyard you might be able to see that is a very elegant way of actually creating biochar and doing useful things. So again, you're going to talk today about soils significantly. There's huge potential in soils, both in terms of agricultural lands and rangelands around building that. So I'm not going to cover that in much detail today. What I want to talk more about is the extent to which forests, and especially urban forests, have an enormous potential and as a consequence represent a whole new area of potential climate action for all of us. The forests in settlements, that's in any sort of settled place of about 1,000 or more, actually sequester up to somewhere around 15% or more of all the forest carbon that's sequestered in the United States, which is kind of remarkable. When you think about the fact that urban forests or forests in general, are sequestering about a quarter of all the emissions that the United States is producing now. The important thing to realize, though, is that it's not just about carbon. Urban forests and forests in general produce an enormous amount of these what we call ecosystem services, from air quality to stormwater management to shade and heat management. And in some cases, we've noted that areas of a settlement can differ in temperature by up to 20 degrees, depending on the forests that we have. So how are we moving forward? Well, there's basically 3 domains that we're we're really moving out with in terms of these natural climate solutions. One is building knowledge and capacity, another is supporting on-the-ground innovation, and a third is figuring out how we then catalyze the expansion of these techniques in many other places. So in terms of new tools, we've actually been working with the Trust for Public Land to build out a whole new set of spatial analysis tools that will enable us to start managing carbon into these living landscapes in specific places to achieve certain outcomes like shade or heat management or stormwater management. You can go online. There's a link into this, I think somewhere. Yes, here it is. This is actually Boulder's draft carbon management tool is now online, and you can go play with it. There's instructions at this website that's linked here, and I'll make sure that the organizers get this slide deck so that you can go and we're inviting people to start playing with these tools. There's only 8 communities in the United States that actually have this tool so far, and Boulder is one of those. We've also been working with other communities around the country to build these carbon management plans. This is a brand new domain of climate action, carbon management plans. Can you believe that? So this is one that we've done in Columbia, Missouri, Lincoln, Nebraska, Iowa City, Iowa. When I say we, the city has actually sponsored a new initiative called the Urban Drawdown Initiative, which is not only working in Boulder, but is actually stimulating this work in other places. And in terms of this, like next steps, as some of you know, we've been working on soil sequestration on city lands since 2017. We have active sites in development there now around this, and there's actually a citizens initiative that's working on an OSMP site that's not only exploring some of these sort of soil treatments, but also introduction of animals. And I think maybe Phil might mention this because Mad Agriculture is a part of that effort. We're also, again, as I say, working with other communities to explore this in kind of a joint initiative of innovation. So we have this group that's called the Carboneers Collaborative, which includes really amazing folks in Detroit, in Cleveland, on the Navajo Nation, where we're experimenting with these new techniques. We have really generous folks here locally who have been financial patrons to help get this off the ground and have invested directly in the work that we're doing on Navajo. And we're starting to move this out in terms of larger initiatives as well. There's a national initiative that Boulder has helped to sponsor to actually propose to Congress that we significantly scale up the amount of funding that's going into urban forests. These are some of the organizations that are a part of that. I also want to encourage folks to think about ways to get involved themselves. There's a really exciting new set of tools called Land PKS. You can find this on the web just at Land PKS. We're likely to work with this initiative that was sponsored by the USDA's Agricultural Research Service and whose lead researcher is now based out of Boulder to launch an initiative we're calling Gardens to Grazing Lands, where we need community members to actually learn this set of tools, which you can actually download on your phone, to start gathering data that will be critical for us to start both getting a baseline of what our existing conditions are now and actually growing out the knowledge that we need to start managing for not only carbon but moisture and all the things that are going to be critical to optimizing these ecosystem services. There's also the very exciting work that EcoCycle's done around the backyard carbon farming, and I think that they're still signing up folks into that program. Those folks are actually starting to learn the Land PKS tool to apply that on their own backyards, and then, like I say, we're going to start to expand that out in this later this year and next year especially into helping us sample across the community. And basically all this sums up to how we start to think about not only stabilizing climate at a global level, but how we intersect that work into regenerating our own communities, not only, of course, here in Boulder, but actually how we grow that community outward. So I'll close by just saying, you know, for me, as a person who gets up every day and has to sort of face climate change and its kind of the terrible progression of it, one of the most hopeful areas, I think, for where we can take positive action, both at a personal level, but also in a way that actually directly affects our community and ultimately the broader context, is through the land. And this is a picture of my son, Nathaniel, standing on one of the city's agricultural holdings that was very significantly degraded, still is in some places, but where we're actually starting to see some really amazing results. And so this is, you know, later that year after we'd started to do some of these treatments that Mad Agriculture actually has been quite involved in. Now I have to say, it's like the reality of any real progression. It's not a sort of general, consistent upward trend. We've actually had serious setbacks at this site. We've learned a lot. We actually have had to change city policy around prairie dog management in order to try to take the pressure off some of these lands that are really so degraded that they can't sustain any sort of intensive animal pressures, whether that's grazing from livestock or from prairie dogs, frankly. But we're starting to learn enough to start, I think, rebuilding these ecological systems and rebuilding the sort of carbon bank account, which is really the source of energy and life for these systems. So I would just say we're really excited to be moving in this direction, and that we look forward to all of you really starting to be a part of this. And so there are many ways that you can have a chance to participate in this. And one of the things that I would suggest is watch closely for the June council session, their study session June 8th, where we'll actually be presenting the broader climate strategy that we're working on, and we'll talk more about our ecosystems work. And we would just invite all of you who are interested in really engaging in this to be in touch so that we can sort of work together to build out this critical work. So thanks all very much, and I hope you have a fantastic discussion today.
Hi, Hunter. Welcome.
Howdy, y'all. For how long do you want me to talk?
10 to 15 minutes.
Perfect.
Okay.
We live in an amazing time in which essentially, well, we're going to get to reinvent everything, as my colleague Catherine Greener puts it. One of the systems that we are reinventing is agriculture. We humanity have lived for 10,000 years or so with agriculture. For much of that time, we did it without artificial inputs of the last 50 years. Those artificial inputs were, to some extent, a result of World War II, of the chemistry that was put together either to produce substitute energy for countries that didn't have access to oil, or various forms of chemical weapons, out of which we discovered how to make artificial fertilizer and various pesticides, herbicides. And coming out of World War II, we started using those extensively to substitute for more natural ways of enhancing soil fertility. As a part of that, we launched what was called the Green Revolution, particularly in places like Africa and India, where we in the West decided that the people there were starving and therefore needed our help. And as with many forms of medication, in the short term, it seemed to help. Production per acre, per hectare went up, and we declared a great success, until the farmers found that they couldn't afford the inputs and the land couldn't afford the chemical assault on it, and productivity started to tail off. In the last 10 years or so, particularly the last 5 years, hunger around the world has been going up, and with the pandemic, it has been going up sharply. In part because of this, but even more because of people's interest in living healthier lives, we have started looking very deeply at how we feed ourselves. As Alan Savory puts it, no human system is possible without photosynthesis. You are not going to have a success of a human system without photosynthesis. And I would add to that, the health of the soil is what enables photosynthesis to be most effective. This is also, by the way, true of the oceans. The nutrients in the ocean are what feed the phytoplankton, which is what begins the food web that feeds the fish and ultimately us. So our entire food system is dependent on the viability of nutrients in whatever medium, whether it be water or soil. And almost all of agriculture has been extractive. How much can we pull out of a piece of ground, out of a river, out of a lake, out of an ocean, rather than how much can we learn? How much can we know about a piece of ground or about our oceans, and design systems that are in harmony with nature, and particularly in harmony with whichever piece of the environment we find ourselves. This approach is variously called agroecology, natural farming, permaculture, regenerative agriculture. It matters little which of the terminology you choose. What matters a lot is, are you starting with the health of the environment around you, particularly the environment under our feet for terrestrial agriculture, the health of the oceans for marine agriculture. Something like 3 billion people depend for most of their protein on food taken from the oceans. So blue food is something that we should consider when we're talking about agriculture. With this growing interest in how do we become healthier, we've begun to realize that we've been treating the soil like dirt, and it is beginning to lose its ability to feed us. So the UN Food and Agriculture Organization warns that we have maybe 60 years, maybe only 30, 60 to 30 more harvests before the soil is too depleted to feed us. And obviously in some parts of the world which lack the artificial inputs, or which have been played out because they've been at it for longer than we have, that time frame is even shorter. So as I said, more and more people around the world are going hungry. And we know how to fix this. And this is the good news. If you start with soil health, you can build the soil's capacity to produce dramatically more food than it did either historically or under chemical agriculture. But you have got to have healthy soil. So a couple of examples. There is an approach called natural farming being practiced now in Andhra Pradesh in India, where farmers had been committing suicide coming out of the Green Revolution because they couldn't afford the costs of the pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers, and the chemicals were killing them. This organization, sponsored by the state of Andhra Pradesh, is training groups of women, particularly in self-help and natural farming. They have 9 principles, and I will put into the chat box first of all, I'll do it this way. The URL for a great video that you can watch that talks about this. That describes the dramatic increases in productivity that the Indians are achieving. It starts with understanding that our farmers must have dignity, and that simply assuming that the way we've always done things will continue to feed us is a recipe for ruin. This is true whether you're in Andhra Pradesh or in Africa. Marvelous man named Million Belay has been working with what they call agroecology. Basically the same thing, starting with empowering the farmers to have the knowledge, to have access to markets, and to begin practicing this farming in harmony with nature, which is doubling the capacity, doubling the productivity even over the highly subsidized modern farming that organizations like the Gates Foundation, the World Bank, and the agrochemical companies have been seeking to impose on Africa. Here in this country, we have now example after example after example. The best you would have seen in the film Kiss the Ground, a man named Gabe Brown. Gabe was going broke. North Dakota commodity corn soybean farmer, couldn't afford the inputs. He said, look, I'm going broke. I'll try anything. First, he went to no-till farming. He stopped breaking the ground. That, by the way, decarbonizes the soil, denitrifies it. He then went to planting cover crops, 28 different species of warm and cool season cover crops, then deep-rooted cover crops. Now his fields are covered with cover crops. He said, how do I get rid of all these cover crops? He turned out his cows. Cows ate the cover crop through the winter. In the spring, he could drill seed his corn and soybeans. He now produces about 12 different products and is profitable. Marvelous book called Dirt to Soil describes Gabe and his family's journey away from mechanized, chemicalized, extractive agriculture to regenerative agriculture. What's interesting about what Gabe did was when he planted those deep-rooted cover crops, they took carbon out of the air and into the soil, and the deep roots took them 1 meter, 2 meters deep into the soil. Gabe, when he started, had soil organic matter, carbon in the soil, of under 2%. He got it up to around 6% when he introduced animal impact, the cows. He got it up to 11%, in some of his fields, 15%. Gabe is rolling climate change backward at a profit. The plants are taking carbon and nitrogen and the other nutrients that they need out of the air and putting it in the soil. So he is farming with no inputs, no fertilizer, herbicides, pesticides, and getting at least as high yields as his neighbors with essentially none of the costs. As a result, he is dramatically more profitable. Will Harris in Bluffton, Georgia, took over his family's cattle operation, which had been run conventionally, had heard about this approach, was concerned that the way in which the animals were being raised was not particularly humane, so converted to regenerative agriculture. A life cycle assessment of Will's operation recently showed, on very conservative assumptions, that he is sequestering in the ground at least as much carbon as his cattle operation would otherwise have been emitting. And I think if they used more realistic assumptions, he would be strongly net negative, i.e. taking more carbon out of the air and putting it into the soil. And I've been to Will's operations. We stayed in a motel about 5 miles south. As we drove north to get to Will's place, you saw miles and miles of bare red dirt, commodity peanut farmers. Until you hit Will's place, where there was ground fog sitting above his grass. There was moisture in the soil. Every 1% soil organic matter is 5 to 10 tons of carbon and 20,000 gallons of water holding capacity. At a time in which we are entering into climate chaos, the ability of ground to soak up these intense rains and hold it and make it available to the plants is particularly important. Gabe says profitability starts with carbon in the soil. Carbon in the soil is the basis of farm health, farmer health, community health, and the health of all of the consumers. So you asked earlier, what can an individual do? I like Bill's answer of stop being an individual, but you can choose to buy your food from farmers and ranchers who are growing it regeneratively. When you do that, you are sequestering carbon every time you take a bite of food. You are helping your personal health. You're helping community health because now the rural community is more viable. Here in Colorado, we have an enormous need to enable farmers and ranchers to get their product to market. Dave put into the chat box that I'm a regenerative rancher. Yeah, and if I wanted to take any of my cattle to slaughter, there is a 1 to 2 years waiting time at the processing plants. Every community should have its own little processing plant, and then you all should be able to buy meat from local farmers. Now, this is not unknown to our Commissioner of Agriculture, Kate Greenberg, with whom I've had this conversation, and we are slowly working towards more regenerative systems here in Colorado. A few years ago, well, not exactly a year ago, some folks at the Alliance Center down in Denver suggested that we start having community meetings around what would a regenerative economy look like in Colorado. Out of that grew an organization called the Colorado Regenerative Recovery Coalition. And I've just put that URL into the chat box. What can you do? Join the coalition. We have about 10 working groups, one on regenerative agriculture, one on energy and climate, one on equity, access, diversity, workforce development, the circular economy. There are a whole series of these working groups which you can become a member of and start learning and start contributing to the answer of what would a regenerative recovery look like in Colorado. And we like to think of ourselves as an extractive industry state. Oh, we're oil and gas, we're mining, we're timber, we're industrial agriculture. Actually, we're not. At Natural Capitalism Solutions, a couple of years ago, we did a study which looked at what is the economy of Colorado. You may recollect when there was this effort to effectively ban fracking. The oil and gas folk threw $50 million to say, you can't limit us. We are the economy of Colorado. I said, really? It turns out that's not true. Oil and gas provides about 40,000 jobs. Before the pandemic, clean energy, 63,000 jobs. So twice, well, half again as much as oil and gas. And oil and gas lost 10,000 jobs in the pandemic. Clean energy lost 1,600 jobs. It's projected to grow this next year at almost 10%, while oil and gas continues to decline. Industrial agriculture declines 1% or 2% year on year, while Boulder is the national center of the natural foods industry, which continues to grow. The number of acres in Colorado in organic production goes up every year. Arts and culture provide 3 times the number of jobs of oil and gas. Outdoor industries 6 times the number of jobs. Colorado is already becoming a more regenerative economy. We just hadn't noticed. So we have the opportunity, I think now, this once in a generation opportunity, I hope, to transform our economy away from the destructive, degenerative practices to an economy that is in service to life. And maybe that's enough to kick off a conversation.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Hunter. So appreciate. Yeah, a lot there to start already. And maybe Pete, we can bring you in to speak about yeah, either also bouncing off of anything that Hunter's presentation brought to your mind, as well as sharing what you're up to in the community here. So thank you.
Okay. Well, I don't really need to do too much because I think Hunter covered it all. She's got it well in hand. And I'm certainly not a person, a good replacement for Phil Taylor. Those of you who have heard him speak know that he's a wonderful speaker and very knowledgeable about what's happening locally and trying to get loans for farmers and so forth. And I do recommend that you check out the Mad Agriculture website sometime. Go hear Phil if you have a chance. Unfortunately, he's worried about his grain crop. One of the things Mad Agriculture has been working on is developing a new kinds of doing research and helping with research into crops that will grow locally and do well, and like and using regenerative methods in growing grain. And I guess they had a lot of hail out east in toward Weld County, and that's where his grain crop is growing, and he had to run out there and try to figure out how much damage is. And so that's just one of the things he does. The Mad Agriculture also works with local farmers, helping them to both financially and with advice and with consultation, trying to help them to move away from the industrial ag model, to find out ways that they can do that easily. And he works hard, Mad Agriculture works hard to bring local people together, local farmers, local organic farmers, local regenerative farmers that are trying to just survive, because it's hard. You know, you have to compete with a pretty ingrained agricultural industrial ag system. But he brings those together, and there's these great meetings at the Grange out north of town on not on Oxford Road. It's up by the haystack there. There's the old Grange, and they get local activists, people that have just support Mad Agriculture. You have a potluck, and then there's speakers and different events that he tries to get local farmers and local activists and local people together. It's been a nice way to make connections for me, and anybody's welcome. You don't have to be like a farmer or even a gardener. You can just be, interested in sustainability and go. So what I work on locally is Earth's Table, which is 6 big gardens that we grow vegetables to donate to food pantries. And it's mostly retired guys running, and two women, 4 male garden managers. We all manage these different gardens, and we use volunteers and donated funds and tried to donate. So I think we donated 43,000 pounds of vegetables last year to food pantries. We get community food share, whatever's the pantry closest to the garden is where we kind of tend to take stuff. And anybody's welcome to come and help us. We don't require training. We'll help you figure out what to do. So, but I wanted to talk a little bit about my garden, and I manage one of the gardens, and I started trying to grow organically. And I think the most useful thing maybe for me is just to say, kind of what I've done, so that somebody else, like, to give you a sense of what's involved in trying to be regenerative. And so I start off just, not using pesticides, thinking, okay, what do I have to do to be organic? I'm not going to use a lot of fertilizer. I'm going to try to do things. And then I started listening to podcasts, and I really recommend. There's a great, so I should put them in the chat when I'm not doing this, when I'm not talking, I'll try to do that. Some podcast suggestion. There's a great one that's done by this Mennonite guy. It's called Regenerative Agriculture Podcast, and it's with John Kemp. He's a Mennonite, what we might have called Amish from Northeast Ohio. Just a really smart guy. And they have these great podcasts. There's Sustainable World Radio. I really recommend. That's an easy way to learn about it. There's some good books. David Montgomery's book, Growing a Revolution, is a great place to start. And he, there's just a lot to learn. But the thing that really has captured my understanding of this is to quit thinking about the soil testing we've done for so long to figure out how much nitrogen and how much phosphate and how much, what's in the, well, that's important. But what makes that accessible to the plants is the microbiome of the soil. It's all the fungus and the microbiotic life that's in the soil. And so there was a joke somebody made that you can feed if you're going to be a gardener or a farmer, you're going to have livestock. You're going to really need Hunter has real livestock. She's got cows, and that's so essential to feeding the soil. You move animals around, and you farm grass for the animals and then move them around, and then they dig at it and they poop and they create the soil. But I'm farming livestock too in my gardens. I'm raising microbes, and you can have livestock on top of the soil, you can have livestock underneath. And what makes nitrogen in the soil work is to have a way to get it to the plant. So that thought, I think, is key to, okay, so now I'm going to change the way I garden, even in my little, comparatively small gardens next to what some of these farms are doing, is, okay, I'm going to quit tilling it. I'm going to quit breaking it up every year, because that breaks down all the chains of fungus, it kills the microbiomes. Everything's got to kind of rearrange itself then. So no, I don't want to till it. So, but sometimes I have to get rid of perennial weeds. But then what we've been using lately is called a power harrow, which is, it only goes down a few inches, and you can make it just an inch or maybe 3 inches, and you just get that cover, like you're trying to kill a cover crop. Well, you just go through this harrow. So you try not to break up the structure of the microbiome of the soil. So, and then you don't want to put a lot of fertilizer on there. I mean, farmers, they do use some fertilizer. Regenerative agriculture doesn't ban fertilizer, but what you've done, if you put a lot of fertilizer right away, is that you've kind of crippled the plant a little bit, because the plant becomes dependent on that fertilizer. It's an easily water soluble source of nitrogen or phosphate or whatever, whereas a plant naturally develops relationships with the microorganisms in the soil. And if it's too easy to just get the fertilizer, they aren't going to establish those connections quickly when they're young plants. They need to be making that connection. So you don't want to pour a lot of fertilizer on it, at least till later, maybe in the season, but you want to make sure that you aren't damaging the microbiome of the soil. So then I thought, okay, well, I'm not going to break this. I got this weed problem. So now what I do is I pile on the mulch. As soon as the tomatoes are established, for example, tomatoes are now this tall, I can put in 4 inches of old hay, that's nice moldy old hay, or I can even use grass clippings, I can use leaves. I put out a sign at my end of my driveway every fall, and I collect couple hundred bags of leaves, and I grind them up. I used to have a grinder and it broke, so now I just use my lawnmower. You just use a lawnmower, just grind up the leaves. Then you can throw those in your compost bin, or you can pile them on. I have like 5 or 10 bags sitting right outside my window that I can look at, that I'm gonna pour on my cabbage as soon as the cabbage is tall enough. So then you don't leave, and then you just leave that mulch. You don't remove it. You don't dig it into the soil. You just kind of let it keep going. So that's one method I use. Now there's different methods, but so stop tilling, grow the soil, feed my livestock, control weeds with mulch. I mean, it's like a different mindset. You just have to stop. And one of our garden managers is Bert. He's 87 years old, and he just keeps saying, is this right? I mean, it's like, it's so different. Because you're used to, okay, you got to make this beautiful seed bed with a tiller so that then you can put your carrots in. Well, no, you don't want to do that. You want to just leave the cover crop on there, break it up, and then plant through it. Because then And okay, that's the other thing that's important that I'm just learning about more is cover crops. The best thing for feeding soil is plants in the soil, because they're, if you guys have read about, the trees, what's that book, The Hidden Life of Trees? Some of you might be aware of that book, or this idea that plants actually have been in collaboration with fungus and microbes since the beginning of time. That's how the soil gets it. So the microbes are fed by the exudates of the plants. So the best way to get nitrogen into the soil or phosphate or anything is the plant itself. So when I'm not planting tomatoes, I'm planting cover crop. And so that keeps going over the winter. And then so that's, they even call it living mulch sometimes. It's just so I can't emphasize enough. I think it's like Hunter says, it's really a revolution in the way we think about agriculture and the way we think about just how we grow our plants and how you grow your tomato plants in your backyard. It's just, we need to think about it differently. And I recommend reading up on it and rethinking how you do it. And it's, what else should I say? I think that's probably plenty. And okay, I think that'll get us started.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Pete. Both of you have brought a lot, and it seems like the video that perhaps Brett recorded it kind of quietly. So what we're going to do, I think, is share the link so people can watch that video, but I don't think we should use our time now. I'm sure that there are a lot of questions. I'm seeing some of them come up in the chat already. So it seems like kind of finding out what's alive in the group and what kind of questions are coming up. Let's just see what's percolating right now.
I would like to have a little bit of discussion about the difference between regenerative agriculture and sustainable agriculture.
Great. Hunter or Pete, do you want to speak?
I'll take a crack at it. John Fullerton, who is one of the people who has sought to define what regenerative means, says sustainability is the outcome of a regenerative system. So in a sense, there is no difference. However, what has been called sustainable agriculture in the past is a catchword for a whole array of practices, some of which I would argue are a little less truly sustainable than others. And it's important to begin to define what principles you're using. So Gabe Brown identified 5 core principles of minimize soil disturbance, maximize crop diversity, keep the soil covered, maintain living root year-round, and integrate livestock. If you look at the work of Alan Savory, he argues the very first thing you need to do is to set the holistic context. What are you trying to achieve? And from that flows all the rest. The folk in Andhra Pradesh have added 3 more principles of things like ensuring farmer dignity, empowering women, and using native seed, indigenous seed. So you can expand or shrink the number of principles that you're working on, but I think it's important when you're defining terms like that to say what principles you're basing it on. And sustainable agriculture never really got round to doing that, whereas regenerative agriculture has done that.
Very quick sentence. I always thought it interesting. I think it's a way to understand this. I heard somebody say once that if we sustain ourselves at our current level, we're going to be failing. So people started using the regenerative word partly just because we actually don't need to sustain the soil where we are. We need to regenerate the soil. We need to actually make things better. So I think that's one argument for changing the language. Otherwise, I think a lot of people use those terms pretty interchangeably.
Thank you, Pete.
I have a question for the panel. This is Michael Holtz. Hi, Hunter. The link between food, nutrition, health, environmental impact, and regenerative agriculture, because obviously agriculture has a purpose of feeding, and hopefully feeding humans first, rather than most of the grain crops growing to feeding pigs and animals and others in CAFOs.
Michael, will you say what CAFOs are for the people who don't know?
Commercial animal feeding operations. These are the large scale places where they just cram full of pigs and chickens and cattle, and it's just disgusting. But anyhow, and Hunter, you should know I'm a vegan.
Confined animal feeding operations are evil, full stop. Cows, pigs, chickens were never designed to eat corn or many of the other grains.
Right.
They get sick when they do. They get sick when they're confined in dense groups with no ability to move around, and you would too. So regenerative agriculture has no part of confined animal feeding operations. Indeed, some of the principles of it require animals to live naturally, and that is to be on the ground, walking around in the sunshine, eating what they are naturally designed to eat. In the case of cattle, that's grass. When cows eat grass, they build up conjugated linoleic acids. Their fat is naturally omega-3 oils. And when you eat that, you are getting the nutrients that you need. You can get that from eating only plants, but then in general, you are eating a lot of processed food. So things like Impossible Meats is pea protein grown monoculturally, in general, grown with a lot of input of chemicals, energy, highly processed. Oh, it's also GMO, and high in sodium. Not exactly healthy.
Right.
So, you can choose what you want to eat, but in general, the highest nutrient density comes from plants and animals produced using regenerative agriculture.
Thank you.
So I just I hear periodically about the challenges to local farmers. And it just seems to me that it should be a high priority for the county to support, to make it easier for local organic farmers. And I wonder if there are any groups that are working on that. I'm not in a position to start something like that, but I certainly would get on board. I love shopping at the Boulder County Farmers Market, or at the Boulder City, I should say. So if anybody has any input, in addition to what Hunter said, which is right to the, commissioners.
Sure, right to the commissioners, shop locally.
Which I do.
When you eat at a restaurant, ask, where did the food come from? And are they shopping locally? So a growing number of restaurants are doing that. The whole farm to table movement is very helpful. The other thing that is just coming in Colorado is called Zero Foodprint, run by a guy named Anthony Mint. What he's doing is getting restaurants to give you the opportunity to opt in for a 1% surcharge on your bill to pay to enable the food waste from the restaurant to be collected, composted, and then given to regenerative farmers. This is beginning to close the loop and eliminate food waste that would otherwise produce methane. There is also a marvelous group run in the Boulder Valley by Woody Tash called Soil, Slow Opportunities for Investing Locally. So those of us who are members put in at least $250 a year. Some people put in a lot more. We meet every month and we give zero interest loans to local farmers and ranchers to support agriculture here in the Boulder Valley. We've of late been giving loans a little bit further afield. There's a great organization in Denver called Emerald Gardens. There is a Ghanaian farmer who has just set up an operation to help support the East Denver Food Hub, which is giving food to various food pantries. There's a growing movement in Denver around urban farming and gardening that the Emerald Gardens folk are very tied into. So we've been giving loans to each of these, in part as a way to get more BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color into or back into agriculture. So lots that you can do locally to help support this.
I think
He-
that
yeah.
I like that soil group a lot too, Hunter. And it's kind of neat because it's people of all different levels of income. I mean, you can get in for 250 or you can give a lot more, but then the decisions are made democratically. So it's a consensus-based group. So we all go in on the Zoom, and then we hear from the farmer who's asking for the loan to buy, whatever, a piece of equipment perhaps, or to put in a greenhouse or a low tunnel, a high tunnel or something. And then everybody discusses it, and then it's like a consensus decision of all the members that are attending as to who should get the loans. It's a neat group. I recommend people joining that.
Mhm.
Does someone else have a question?
I'm taking notes and I couldn't write fast enough. What does SOIL stand for? Slow opportunities, what?
For
Investing locally.
Okay, thank you.
So in the chat, David is sharing that the local group doing community urban landscapes is Boundless Landscaping. And I think, Pete, Boundless Landscaping was part of on Community United Church of Christ. You all started with them. Will you share a little bit about what?
I should have said something. Mara Rose, one of the founders and operating officer of Boundless Landscapes, and they work in Boulder, and they develop what they call micro farms, I believe, micro gardens. Anybody remember? Anyway, so you contract with them to come to your land, your little, even if you just have a small city lot, and they will put in raised beds, and then they take care of those for you, give you a percentage of the food that's grown, and then the rest is donated to food pantries. And they are trying to, get rid of grass, trying to encourage people to grow victory gardens basically in your yard, and you hire them in a sense instead of a landscaping company. You pay them a certain amount of money, and then they come and they do this for you. And it's called Boundless Landscapes. And they had a big garden at our church, and they found it wasn't really economically viable for them to have these big gardens. They were trying to hire teenagers. They're still hiring teenagers, but they were going to have the teenagers get some experience selling their products as well as donating them, not to make a profit, just to break even. And they didn't break even, basically. The big gardens didn't pan out. They weren't able to grow enough food. It was good experience for the teenagers marketing their vegetables, but it wasn't economically feasible. So they quit doing that. So the garden at our church, for example, is now reverting to be a donation garden. But But anyway, people can hire them. She's got a lot of gardens in the Table Mesa area, which is where she happens to live. But they aspire to go to all over Boulder or Denver or wherever people would like to hire them to grow, to make a micro garden, micro farm in your yard.
And I put the link in the chat, and so it's there. I'm also remembering that part of the talk that Brett gave that you can watch after this, he mentioned EcoCycle, and I'll put that link in, but it was when you said, Pete, the piece about trying to get rid of grass, and that there's programs through EcoCycle. Gaia, you might have just done this. I would love to hear where they will give you a garden. Gaia, will you share what your experience was?
Yeah. Yeah, if you're willing to get rid of your grass, a certain amount, it has to be a certain amount, but not very much. Then I don't think they have any left for this year, but they'll probably do it again next year, or maybe even in the fall. Then they will deliver to you, or you'll pick up $250 worth of xeric plants that are also attracting pollinators. It's not food oriented, it's more, flower oriented. So I'm removing my grass. I hope I'm removing my grass. I've had it covered for I covered it in the fall. But a lot of people have said grass is so tenacious. When I take off the cardboard and everything else, it may still be there. Anyway, you can also hire Resource Central to take out your grass. So if this doesn't work, I guess I'll have to pay them. But anyway, I'm going to get those xeric plants in May. And since I have the floor, Pete, would you say a little more about how you're doing cover cropping? I do cover cropping, but I never really know do I leave the cover crop in and plant between it? Because the cover crop is just coming up, the spring one is, the fall one. Anyway, the growing season is so short. Or do I dig it in? I don't want to dig it in. So what do you do with your cover crop? That's what I would love to know.
Well, this is what I'm learning too. So I'm not an expert, Gaia, but I'll tell you what I've learned. And I'm trying different methods, but one method is to cover it, mow it. Regardless, I mow it down as short as I can do it. And then one method is to cover it with black plastic and kill it. And then uncover it, dig it, just dig in the dead material, just leave everything there and plant. Another method, what I'm trying, is to mow it as flat as I can, as short as I can get it, and then harrow it. Use this power harrow, which you're not going to have, but it breaks it up, and it just goes down like 2 inches and breaks it all up, and then plant through it. I don't remove any of the plant material. Anything I mow, I leave on there, anything I dig. And then the last method, which I end up using a lot because I run out of time, is mowing it flat, letting it die off a little bit, and then I dig it in with a fork. And some of the plants come back because they're persistent.
Sure.
And I just don't worry too much about it. My garden doesn't look as neat as it used to. But
you could just plant between it too.
You can. Some people, and so, all right. So, and Hunter could tell us more about this probably, but I know that at the large scale, what they do is they mow it. Some kill it with herbicide, which, that's a pretty common method, because then you still got the organic material in there. It sounds counterintuitive, but some people do it. But then you mow it, and then you do plant through it. Use what do they call those, Hunter? It's a grain drill basically, but it basically goes through, breaks it up, cuts it, plants right through it, and then the next crop comes up in the stubble.
Isn't that a rototiller?
No, they're not tilling it. They're just cutting back the cover and then planting through it. Do you have anything to add on that, Hunt? And what am I missing on that?
It depends how big your operation is. It depends what it is you're trying to achieve. Myself, I would stay away from poisons, full stop. Poisons kill the microbiological life that Pete was talking about. That life in the soil is key to everything that you want to try to achieve, whether it be your own personal health or increased productivity of your farm, sequestration of carbon in the soil. So at all costs, what you want to do is enhance life in the soil. And then you can do soil tests to see which cover crop you want to plant to achieve the right chemical balance, or you can just experiment. And if you're doing your own home garden, try something and see how it worked out.
Thanks.
So for these sorts of questions, these like home garden attempts at regenerative agriculture, which is, it feels like a different world, even though the principles may be the same. I'm just curious what our local sources for, I know Boundless Landscaping offers consultations if you're working with them. Are there classes, like when I've attended, master gardener classes, they aren't teaching these sorts of techniques. So I'm just curious what, I'll do the podcasts, but yeah, what kinds of mentorship?
The one class I took was a permaculture design certificate. I do recommend looking at things through the lens of permaculture as opposed to the master gardener classes. I agree. And a lot of those are frankly geared toward growing in the Midwest still. I mean, it's a different mindset. So I wouldn't recommend that. I don't know. Anybody else know other local classes on that? I mean, that you're certainly able, you feel free to call Earth Table folks. We're struggling with these things, and we do it on a medium to small scale, so you could see how we're dealing with our cover crops. It's a new thing, it's a new, you just try to, I agree with Hunter, experiment with different methods. The best thing, I kill it off and fork it in. And yeah.
Lodi, I have a question. Some of us are gardeners, some of us aren't. My garden is totally small, so just takes a couple days, and then we've got everything done. How do I eat regeneratively? I'd love to buy Hunter's beef. How do I do that? I mean, I go to Safeway. Sometimes I even go to Whole Foods when I'm feeling rich. How do I do it?
Start with the Boulder Farmers Market, which is now online. You can buy local meat, local eggs, local honey, local vegetables. It has become a real marketplace of local produce. You guys might also, oh, help me somebody, I've just blanked on the name of the guy who's running the Boulder Farmers Market. He's a member of Soil. You could have him come and talk to you about what the Boulder Farmers Market is endeavoring to do, which is, by the way, also the Longmont Farmers Market. And they have, they also do distribution in the Denver area. So start with the farmers market. If what you're paying is more than what you're used to paying, start with small amounts. But look at your own lifestyle, cut out what's harming you. So junk food of any sort, or cigarettes if you smoke them, or whatever it is you're doing that's harmful to your life. Take that money and put it into buying a little better quality meat, locally raised eggs, locally raised milk, and buy the necessities that are high quality. Then if you want to go buy a candy bar, you can do that. But if you're serious about increasing your own personal health, buy high quality, locally produced, regeneratively grown food. You'll be amazed at how much better you feel.
So we've got about 5 minutes. I want to ask just about what programs exist to help low-income folks access healthy food. If, once money comes up, certainly there's plenty of folks in Boulder who could be putting money in this direction. And then there's lots of folks for whom, the cheaper foods that aren't actually good for us are what people are buying. Are there programs? I mean, it sounds like Pete, the Earth's Table is for donations. So those are available at food banks, but perhaps the individual spot, individual's the wrong word, the in-between place. Just curious if there are pieces happening there.
This is Michael, the follow-on question to Lodi's, because it's a political question, but political at maybe different levels. We can certainly talk about national policy, agricultural policy, but county-wise, our Boulder County Commission is supportive of regenerative agriculture and supporting farmers. We need to support our farmers. Both the county, every county in the country needs to be farmers need to be supportive. So what are the things happening that are really helping farmers make this transition from the traditional, the ways they are doing it now, to more regenerative methods? I'm sure Hunter's in the middle of that.
Thanks, Pete, for putting Brian Copham's name in. He's the one who runs the local farmers market. I was just scrabbling through my notes to try to find that. There are a growing number of groups reaching out into disadvantaged communities and trying to help them create their own ability to grow food sovereignty, so that local communities are growing the kind of food that they traditionally ate. And the East Denver Food Hub is a really good place to start with this conversation. Roberto Maes is the guy who runs that. The Ugly Food Initiative is taking food that otherwise wouldn't be saleable in a Whole Foods market, but ensuring that it gets to food pantries. There is a local gleaning movement that was also popped into the chat box. The politics seem to be that the Boulder County Commissioners are in favor of this stuff, but they don't yet have a truly effective program to enable farmers to make that 1 to 3 year transition away from chemical farming to regenerative farming. Phil Taylor is working on that. And I know Boulder County Commissioners have been working with Phil. There is interesting possibilities coming out of the new federal legislation that there will be some support to help carbon farming, which is just another name for how do you farm in ways that take carbon out of the air and put it into the soil, the best of which is regenerative farming. So watch this space, but the most important thing you can do is anytime you buy food in a restaurant, at a grocery store, ask if it's local, ask if it's regenerative. And if the person gives you a puzzled look, say, look, I would buy this stuff. Kindly make it available to me.
Right on.
Have we mentioned CSAs? I might have missed that. Community supported agriculture. Probably many of you know what that is. I think that's another way to be definitely local, is to identify a CSA that maybe the Kilt Farm or someplace, and do business with them. And that's a good way to really help, because a lot of these local, particularly the ones growing vegetables, have some form of CSA. I know Masa Seed does, Rich Pecorino and Pecoraro, and they're doing CSA stuff locally, and a lot of their income comes from that. So that can help.
this is actually the perfect place to end. Boulder GreenFaith at gmail.com. That's the way to sign up to be on the mailing list, the email list for this group. So if you're not already on that, we would love for you to be, if you would love to be. And I think what Pete was just saying and all of the different resources that were just happening made me want to read this part of the poem. But before I do, David put something in the chat about it before, where the Kiss the Ground title of the piece came from. But I just really want to extend much appreciation and thank yous to Hunter. I had not met you before and so appreciate. Oh, here, let's unmute. Let's give up some love for Hunter. Thank you.
Thank
Everybody.
you, Hunter.
Thank you, Hunter.
And let's throw up some love for Pete stepping into this literally 2 minutes before this came on.
Yay, Pete. Thank you, Pete.
And the video from Brett is really good and might generate more questions. So I'll also put his email in the chat if you want to follow up with him. So let me just end with this piece. Today, so this is from Rumi, and it's a stanza of the poem that this comes from. Today, like every other day, we wake up empty and frightened. Don't open the door to the study and begin reading. Take down a musical instrument. Let the beauty we love be what we do. There are hundreds of ways to kneel and kiss the ground. So thank you all so much for spending your Sunday afternoon here.